Thank you all for coming. Before I introduce Ian, I just want to tell you about the mechanics of what's going to happen today. So if you haven't been to one of these before, Ian's going to talk for about 50 minutes. Then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. Then everybody who's not on the committee will leave the room, and we stay here, I assume. We'll continue to sort of ask him questions and make him defend what he's done. And then we will all see you afterwards, I assume, for a celebration. So it's a pleasure to introduce Ian. Ian was my first grad student at Stanford. He came here basically the same year that I came here. And he came very well prepared. He had worked with the other Michael J. Frank at Brown as an undergrad, and then worked for a couple years at NIH as a postbac. But his CV didn't really prepare me for what it was going to be like to work with him. And you've seen, hopefully some of you at least have seen these videos of a passenger in a Tesla when the driver hits insane mode and accelerates. And that sort of captures what it felt like when he joined the lab. And so I knew it was going to be a pretty thrilling ride. So his first year project was pretty kind of straightforward computational cognitive neuroscience, looking at learning of task sets from experience. It's good work. Got a talk at Cognitive Science in 2016. But he really wanted to do something bigger and kind of broader and more impactful than kind of regular old computational cognitive science. So he latched onto a set of ideas that I've been playing with for a long time around cognitive ontologies. And it's a set of ideas that I had never felt comfortable actually having a grad student go after because I thought they were just too far out there. But he took them and ran with them and did really a massive project, along with a number of others in the room here. You're going to see the results of that project today. What I've always appreciated about Ian is his desire to have a really systematic, cumulative, comprehensive understanding of how mind and brain work, and his willingness to question established ideas, to try to go after that, and to bring to bear lots, really broad set of methods to ask these questions. So I hope that you'll find the next 50 minutes as thrilling as the last 5 years have been for me. So.
Thanks, Russ. So I'm really excited to talk to you today about my PhD work. So my talk is titled Uncovering Structure Through Data-Driven Ontology Discovery. And I'm basically going to be talking to you today about a framework I've developed to integrate a number of psychological theories and understand complicated mental concepts. And I'm going to do this by focusing on the concept of self-regulation. So on its face, self-regulation is a rather intuitive concept. It's the ability that we all have to put off short-term kind of attractive distractions in favor of our long-term goals. It's our ability to study late at night when going out would be more fun, or stop after one, or no cookies when we know another would be delicious, or wake up on a cold winter morning when all we'd rather do is press the snooze button. It's also intuitive to think about self-regulation as an individual difference, something that we vary on. Some people are good self-regulators, and some not so good. Self-regulation has been a focus of many research programs, and different scientists have come up with a multitude of measures and kind of tasks to probe different kinds of self-regulatory functions. One quite popular and famous example is the so-called marshmallow experiment. So in this experiment, young children were given a marshmallow and told that if they wait 15 minutes to eat it, they could get a second marshmallow. Now, of course, some children waited and some didn't. The researchers talked about the ones that waited as having a better ability to delay gratification. So what made this study particularly compelling wasn't that it kind of divided children in maybe arbitrary ways, but that the children who waited to eat the marshmallow seemed to do well later in life on a host of different outcomes, including academic performance. It's kind of hard to overstate the impact of this study. And while it has been questioned recently for a number of different reasons, I think one of the reasons it was so impactful is because it corresponded closely to our folk psychological ideas about what allows a person to be successful in life. So with that, let's give self-regulation a more precise definition. I'm going to say that it is the ability to recruit cognitive, emotional, or motivational resources to achieve one's long-term goals. As such, it should be relevant for a number of real-world outcomes. For instance, maybe it's important for kind of drug adherence or healthy eating, academic and life performance, maybe even mental health and functioning. But what are those kind of emotional, cognitive, and motivational resources? There are actually probably a number of them. We've seen one already, the ability to delay gratification. There are a number of other ones, like reward sensitivity or impulsivity. These are psychological constructs. They're the theoretical components of the mind that might make up self-regulation. But if we have a number of different psychological constructs, what's the utility in wrapping them in this label, self-regulation? Why should we draw this circle around them? Maybe it's better to just think about them as separate. There are a number of different psychological constructs. They might predict different outcomes. They might not do it in a consistent way. To talk about self-regulation is to say that there is a coherent subset of psychological constructs that are responsible for all of these outcomes. Maybe there aren't. Maybe what we call self-regulation isn't actually an ability at all, but rather the consequence of recruiting psychological functions. And when that consequence bears out in societally valuable ways, we call that self-regulation. Maybe that's the case. Moreover, so far I've assumed that self-regulation, whatever it is strongly associated with a number of important outcomes. How do psychologists assess that? Well, in general, they come up with some way to measure a particular component of self-regulation, and another way to measure the outcomes of interest. And then they look to see if there's a statistically significant association between the two. Now, some of you might be familiar with the debate between null hypothesis significance testing and effect sizes, and it comes into play here. If the relationship between these constructs and these outcomes wasn't like this, but rather like this, much weaker, we'd think about self-regulation differently. Even if it was a thing, it wouldn't be an important consideration when trying to deal with society's ills. It just wouldn't be an important explanation of most of how humans behave. So these questions I've gone over here, like how do we try to understand a multifaceted construct like self-regulation? What are its subcomponents? How do they relate to each other? How do they relate to the real world? These are just generally important psychological questions. They're foundational to how psychologists go about trying to understand the mind. I use self-regulation as my case study because it's multifaceted with many moving parts and because it's a potentially great societal value. But the perspectives and methods that I'm going to talk about today apply to any multifaceted construct. And that's because the work that I'm going to talk about addresses foundational questions in psychology. We're trying to define mental functions and how they relate to each other and the real world. I'm going to call the structure that defines these mental functions and relationships a psychological ontology. And today I'm going to present a quantitative framework to create such a psychological ontology and lay the groundwork for a more cumulative psychological science. That is one that kind of combines disparate research programs into a cohesive whole. And there's some grounds to think that it's important to focus on cumulative science in psychology. It's been criticized for its lack of cumulative nature in the past. For instance, Rossi says that many observers have noted the failure of psychology as a cumulative science. Although many reasons can be advanced for this problem, perhaps the most important is the dependence of the behavioral sciences on the paradigm. Here what he's talking about is that most research programs focus on one or a few tasks. And while great theoretical perspectives and computational frameworks have come out of that close study of individual tasks, it's difficult to come up with a generalizable science of human behavior when we look at these tasks separately. Newell has a more extended and pithy criticism. You can't play 20 questions with nature and win. While this dovetails with the paradigm point, it's actually much broader. scientists must take the time to synthesize. To progress the science of human behavior, we must take the piecemeal findings from a number of research programs and bring them together. Okay, so that intro, I'd just like to outline the rest of my talk. So first I'm going to introduce a data set I've collected to try to understand the structure of self-regulation and how it relates to the real world behavior. I'll then take you through that structure where I develop this quantitative framework to create a psychological ontology. And finally, I'll go through some prediction work which helps clarify how these different mental functions relate to the real world. So let's start with the data set. So to understand self-regulation, we took a large-scale individual differences approach. So basically what that means is we measured a number of different psychological measurements on a number of different people. Specifically, we had 522 people complete 59 different psychological measures on mechanical Turk. We also had them complete a number of real-world questionnaires. So these weren't meant to measure anything necessarily psychological. We're supposed to assess things like how often do you smoke, your drinking behavior, your weight, your financial outcomes, the things that we might be interested in predicting using psychological measures. We also brought 150 people back in a few months later to take the entire battery over again. And this allows us to assess the test-retest reliability of our measures. This will be important when we move to the prediction work in the third section of the talk. So these 59 measures were broken into two large categories. First, we had behavioral tasks. So these were generally had kind of a stimuli where the participant had to respond in some way. There's often a performative aspect to this, these tasks, like you could do well on them. We also had a number of self-report surveys. So these were questionnaires where you would respond like maybe how much you agree or disagree with some statement. And there were 22 of these. Altogether, these 59 measures covered a broad swath of psychological functions. And while many of the things that they're kind of probing are putatively related to self-regulation, they relate to a broader span of psychological constructs, like personality. Importantly, across the two measurement categories, we also probed the same psychological construct, or they were supposed to probe the same psychological construct. For instance, impulsivity was supposed to be measured by both behavioral tasks and these self-report surveys. Okay, so from those 59 measures, we calculated a number of dependent variables. These are the quantitative summaries that will serve of each task, that will serve as the individual difference metrics that we'll use. For surveys, the DVs we calculated were rather simple. For instance, the grit scale is composed of questions like, new ideas and projects sometimes distract me from previous ones, or setbacks don't discourage me. You'll rate these different items, and then we'll just sum them up, and that'll give you your total grit score. So in general for the surveys, we followed the original designer's way of kind of summing up the different items to give us our subscale scores. On the other hand, our behavioral tests were more heterogeneous. Each of the 37 tests had its own unique analytical framework. To give you just a little bit of a flavor of how we approach each task, I'm going to talk about one class of tasks, so-called two alternative force choice tasks, or two AFC tasks. So these are tasks where you're shown a stimulus, you have to make one of two choices. And we typically ask you to make those choices as quickly and accurately as possible. So in this task, which is the simplest two AFC task that we had, called the choice reaction time task, you're shown a rectangle. You just press the corresponding key. So if it's an orange rectangle, you press right, purple rectangle, you'll press left. The main outcome variables that we can calculate from a task like this are accuracy, how often you get it right, and the average reaction time. So how long did it take you to press the button? So let's say one participant was accurate 96% of the time, and the response time was 552 milliseconds on average. And we had another participant whose accuracy was 90%, but was responded faster, 428 milliseconds. Who's better at the task? Well, it's actually a little difficult to say. One person was more accurate but slower, and one person was less accurate but faster. In general, tasks like this are confounded by what's called the speed-accuracy trade-off. That is, generally, you can go slower on a task and become more accurate, or the opposite. We were interested in trying to understand tasks like this by separating out the strategic component, whether you prefer speed over accuracy or vice versa, from this performance component. How good are you at the task? And to do that, we employed a modeling framework called the drift diffusion model. So the drift diffusion model is a particular perspective on decision-making processes. It sees decision-making as a noisy accumulation of information until it hits one of two decision boundaries. The top boundary here would be a correct choice, and the bottom boundary would be an incorrect choice. So here we see one decision, information accumulated kind of in the person's mind over time, and eventually it hit the top bound. So this would be a correct decision, and it took 1,350 milliseconds. And because this is noisy, occasionally it's going to hit the bottom boundary, and the model is going to get it incorrect, and occasionally it's going to hit the top boundary. And at the top and bottom, we can see the reaction time distributions for the correct and incorrect trials. And most models, of course, are going to get it right more often than wrong, and we can see that in the different area of the two distributions. So this is a perspective on decision making, and we can actually use it to fit human behavior and extract a number of more interpretable variables. So the first one we extract is called the threshold. This is the distance from the starting point to the decision boundary. And this encapsulates the speed accuracy trade-off explicitly. If the threshold is higher, there's a larger distance between the starting point and the decision boundary. You'll go slower, but be more accurate. And if the decision boundary is lower, threshold is lower, it'll be faster, but less accurate. The drift rate is a more pure measure of now performance. The drift rate is the average slope of the information accumulation. If the drift rate is higher, it'll be faster and more accurate. If it's lower, it'll be slower and less accurate. And finally, we have non-decision time. So this is the aspect of the reaction time that isn't actually devoted to making a decision at all. It's the amount of time needed to perceive the stimulus and affect the motor movement, press a key, something like that. So this is what we did. We transformed accuracy and reaction time into these three more interpretable dependent variables for this task. And again, just as a reminder, this is just one task. And we used this framework for a number of our 2 AFC tasks, but there were many others that were just completely different than this that I can't go through today. Okay, so the end result is that we have these 59 measures, and they are all converted into a number of dependent variables. So at the bottom, we see the choice reaction time task. Again, we see our 3 DDM measures, threshold, non-decision time, and drift rate. And across this line here, we can see variability. So these are each a person. We can see variability in their threshold. So we see that different people kind of prefer speed over accuracy to a different degree. Up above, we see another task, the stop signal task. The stop signal task also has a 2 AFC component. So it also was analyzed using the DDM, and we see the same kind of measure, the drift rate, non-decision time, and threshold. But we have another dependent variable here, the stop signal reaction time, which is a measure of response inhibition. So the point here is that depending on the measure, we had overlapping or disparate kinds of DVs that we calculated, and that people varied across them. So, yeah, Anthony.
Can I ask, I might have asked you this before, but you can imagine taking the choice RT and looking at response timing, response repetition, sort of aspects of the experimental design that might get you maybe not a response inhibition variable, but something conceptually aligned.
Yeah.
Comment on
The particular choices of the dependent variables? Yeah, so what Anthony is bringing up here is the way that I analyze the task, or of course not the only way that they can be analyzed. And for tasks where you make iterative decisions, many people are interested in like sequential effects or other kinds of things that you might be able to extract. I think what we ended up, the kind of decision process we took in choosing our different dependent variables is first we calculated actually a number of them that weren't included in the last round, and we had a filtering process if they were overly correlated. And the second one is we tried to make this, what I'm calling the first level analysis, relatively straightforward. That is, we wanted it to be mostly incontroversial, like not an aspect of the task that is a particular theoretical interest, but just kind of a general way of analyzing that task. And our choice to use the drift diffusion model might vary, deviate from that slightly, but we didn't want to get into kind of the weeds of sequential decision making. Kind of.
I'm happy to let that go, but the weeds are in essence the heart of your project, which is to try to understand, come up with a psychological.
Absolutely.
I'll let you go.
I'll respond in one other way, which is to say we chose a subset of dependent variables, and we anticipate that other people certainly experts in, for instance, sequential decision making might have other ways of analyzing the task. And this is really the essence of something that I'm not going to talk about, but why we are so committed to kind of sharing the data and want it to be kind of reanalyzed in the future. Because of course, this is only one perspective on how you can analyze these tasks. Okay, so the end result here is that we have a matrix, essentially, of 522 participants by 193 psychological features. These are the dependent variables. And with that, I'm going to go on to the structure, which is a kind of perspective on the data set. Okay, so underlying the analyses I'm going to show you moving forward is a simple idea. The idea is that if two dependent variables are correlated, it indicates shared psychological structure. So here are two variables that are moderately correlated for psychological measures. And our first question was that how do tasks and surveys, these two large measurement categories, relate to each other? Remember, there was some overlap in the psychological constructs probed by both measurement categories, so we should anticipate some relationship between the two. Is that what we see? So what I'm showing you here is the full Pearson correlation matrix of all 193 DVs. Each of these cells represents a correlation. It's actually the absolute value of the correlation. If the correlation is higher, the cell is going to be more red. And what we can see is that while there's a decent amount of structure within tasks and within surveys, there's really no structure at all between tasks and surveys. And this can actually be visualized very easily using a psychological graph. Here, each circle is a different DV, and I've colored the behavioral task blue and the surveys red. And we can see that they're essentially disconnected. And because of this, we're going to try to understand the structure of the tasks and surveys separately, because it seems that there is a top-level ontological distinction between the two measurement categories. That is, it seems that they might measure different cognitive constructs. Okay, so moving on, before I talk about the particular analytical strategy that I'm going to be using, I want to introduce the concept of a psychological space. Deciphering mental structure is akin to defining the axes and boundaries of the space and understanding how behaviors and measures are organized within it. In this plot, you can think of each of these dots as one of the DVs, so this is like the choice reaction time drift rate. When two measures are close together in the space, it means that they're correlated. Intuitively, we can think about correlation indicating close psychological, a close psychological overlap, which is manifested in close distance in the space. And it gives us a lot of benefits. For instance, we can think about, now if we think about distance as psychological overlap, we can see that this measure is psychologically close to this measure, but far away from this one. Whereas these measures seem to clump together, they're a cluster in this space. An additional benefit of thinking about this space is if we have a new measure, a new dependent variable, and we find a way to project it into the space, we suddenly know a lot about it. We know that it's far away from this guy and close together with these other guys. So really, I see a psychological space as a really helpful metaphor and visualization technique. It's helpful for us to understand how psychological measures can be similar and dissimilar from each other without needing to postulate categorical boundaries. At the same time, we can appreciate when different measures clump together or cluster in the space. Okay, so how are we going to actually define such a space? Well, we're going to use a classic measure in psychology called exploratory factor analysis. So right now, each of these measures we can think about as being represented by a 522-dimensional vector of the participants. It's in like a participant space. But we can project that into a lower dimensional factor space. Now, in this factor space, the DV loadings represent the coordinates of this measure in the space. So the drift rate, the stop signal task, loads heavily on factor 1 and loads a little bit on factor 4. You can think of these factors as kind of the psychological primitives that are weighted together and added together to give rise to this outcome. Okay? But what, like, for it to really help us, we have to understand what factor 1 is. So how do we understand factor 1? Well, an easy way to do this is to use a priori intuitions about what the DVs actually measure. So if we look at these 7 factors, we can see that drift rate, regardless of the task, seems to load on factor 1. And by looking at that, we can kind of try to come up with a label for this factor. So if we remember, drift rate measures kind of the information processing and speed of decision-making tasks. So we call this factor speeded information processing. Of course, we looked at all 129 task DVs, not just these 7. Now, it's important to note that there's nothing fundamental about these particular dimensions. They were defined by not completely arbitrary objectives that give us the particular dimensions, but I think for the purpose of this talk, it's better to think about them as a convenient way to understand a psychological space. They give us a way to understand what it means for a DV to be in a certain area of that space. So for instance, when we see that a measure loads heavily on this dimension, we know that it shares something in common with drift rate measures, and that gives us a handle on what that measure is actually probing. Okay, so let's see what this looks like in practice. Like, how does it actually work out on our data set? So here I'm showing just a subset of measures so we can get a handle on this whole thing. So there are a few things that we can take away here. So I'm just showing nine task measures here. We're going to look at the task structure first. The first thing is the actual dimensionality of the space. So we started with 129 measures, and we've projected them into a 5-dimensional space. The next thing we can take away is, what are those actual dimensions? Well, 3 of them correspond to the drift diffusion model. We've seen speeded information processing already. Caution is associated with the threshold measures, and perception/response is associated with the non-decision time measures. Now, it's important to note that it's not exclusively associated with those measures, but the drift rate, threshold, and non-decision time are all strongly load differentially on these different factors and help us understand what they're measuring. We also have a discounting factor. So this relates to what are called temporal discounting tasks. These are tasks where you're asked to, like, which would you prefer, $20 today or $50 in a week? They're somewhat analogous to the marshmallow task that I talked about at the beginning, your ability to delay gratification. There's a different factor for that. And then we have strategic information processing, which relates to a heterogeneous number of measures that relate to things like IQ, working memory, reward kind of processing, a number of different things. Okay, so here I'm showing you one cluster of measures. And if we put that to the left here, I can expand this out and we can see all 129 measures now in this whole space. And you can see that I've organized the space. Down here we have the factor loadings, but I've also organized it using a hierarchical clustering algorithm. And then I've cut the hierarchical tree using a tree, like a cluster finding algorithm. And I went about then naming these clusters using an analogous method to how we name the factors. That is, people in the lab looked at the DVs and tried to use kind of theoretical intuitions to come up with a label that allows us to kind of get a quick understanding of what it means for measures to be in this cluster. Importantly, what's going on here is that, like the fact that we find clusters, what it's really indicating is that DVs are not evenly distributed throughout the quantitative space. Now, whether these clumps are a product of human psychology or psychological measurement, or even just our battery, it's hard to say at this point. But the reality is that there are kind of some clumping of measures in this space. Okay, so that's the task structure. We can do the same thing for surveys. We get 64 survey measures. And here we see we now have 12 dimensions, so the dimensionality wasn't reduced as much. And we can also see that there's a relatively simple relationship with most DVs and the factors. That is, they mostly heavily load on one factor. And combined, this lack of dimensionality reduction and this clean relationship to different factors is actually nicely convergent with survey literature and a positive mark for survey designers. In psychology, many survey designers are interested in not just the kind of convergent or predictive validity of their measures, but the divergent validity. That is, when they make a new measure, they want it to measure something new, not something measured already. And the fact that we see kind of a clean breakdown is kind of good news, I guess, for survey designers. The actual factors that we find are mostly kind of constructs that are already talked about in the field. Things like sensation seeking, or impulsivity, or goal directedness, reward sensitivity. these all very cleanly associated with surveys that were supposed to measure these kinds of constructs. So again, conversion of the literature. Okay. So even though I've been showing you this analysis using those visualizations, this dendrogram heat map, I just want to reemphasize that those visualizations are helpful to understand my particular analytical framework. But in the end, what we did was define a psychological space. So here I'm just projecting the 5-dimensional task space into 2 dimensions using a technique called T-sneak. And I've colored them according to their cluster colors. And what we got was each DV now has a coordinate in a 5-dimensional space. And this is really the heart of the quantitative ontology. Before I mentioned that it would be helpful to project new DVs into the space. And the reason why that's so important is because if we don't do this, then what we end up with is a static structure. And this structure gives us a number of insights. It tells us the dimensions of, like, some psychological dimensions that might be important. It tells us that surveys and tasks aren't related to each other. It tells us about things that clump together. But in the end, these are just kind of independent findings that can be taken from other people as kind of verbal theories. And this is, in general, how techniques like this have been used in the past. But for the quantitative nature of this framework to really help in cumulative science, for it to help theory development, to help new scientists, it would be more helpful if we could project new measures into the space, and by getting the coordinates, have kind of a quantitative understanding of the psychological underpinnings of this new measure. This would be a way to not have to project into words the psychological underpinnings of measures, but stay in this nice quantitative space. And it turns out that you can do this by using a method called k-nearest neighbor regression. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to find where this measure, how this measure is associated with a few tasks in the participant space. You just see if it's correlated with other measures. Because you know where these other measures are, the kind of contextual measures, are in this space, you can triangulate this measure in this space using a weighted kind of distance based on the correlations here. So this gives you a representation of this DV in this space. Okay. So I don't have actually the time in this talk to tell you about how I actually went about doing this, how I simulated how well this works, and kind of quantified its success. But suffice to say, it works reasonably well, and if you're interested in it, we can talk about this either offline or questions. So the end result is that we're able to define a psychological space that can be iteratively improved over time. And this gives us a structure that can operate as a field-wide resource. Another perspective on what this gives us is a way to take the insights gained from large, well-powered studies and apply them to smaller studies. If you're kind of developing a new measure, you have a new perspective on some psychological function, come up with a new measure, it's impractical, of course, to measure it with 500 people and 58 other tasks. That's just impossible. But at the same time, you might want to contextualize your measure, try to understand it in the context of larger studies. And using methods like the one that I briefly alluded to, you can measure it along with a number of other tasks, not 58, but let's say 5, and start to get a sense of how you should think about this measure based on a large study. So again, this is another way we can look about it. Just how can we effectively take insights from large, well-powered studies and apply them to smaller studies? Okay, so that's the structure. Let's move on to the last section of the talk. So this is the section where we're trying to understand the real-world connections of psychological measurements. So we're interested in individual variability in psychological, how individual variability in psychological function affects real-world behavior. And if you remember, each of these is a different person on one DV. And so each of these columns, you can think about as like the psychological fingerprint of that person in 100, each person is now represented by 193 measures. And we could potentially use that to try to predict kind of real world outcomes. We're actually not going to do that though. Instead, we're going to make use of something called factor scores. That is, using the structure we defined in the last section, we can not only understand kind of the more fundamental psychological dimensions of the DVs, but also we can understand each individual along these more fundamental psychological dimensions. over these 5 task factors and then 12 survey factors. So for instance, we can see that this person is pretty high on speeded information processing. And it's going to be these factors that we're going to use to predict the real world measures. And what are we going to actually predict? Well, I mentioned at the beginning that we kind of collected a number of real world outcomes. So for instance, we collected measures like how often do you drink remarks? How often have you failed activities due to drinking? How often can't you stop drinking? We actually used factor analysis to reduce the dimensionality of the outcomes, just like we did for the psychological measures. So problem drinking was a factor that loaded on these 3 measures, while binge drinking loaded on how often do you drink more than 6 times a day? How many drinks do you have per day? Altogether, we had 8 outcome factors. We had these 2 drinking factors, 2 smoking factors, drug use, mental health, so these are questions like how often in the last month have you felt depressed or hopeless, obesity, and life outcomes, so like household income, these kinds of things. So these are the things we're going to try to predict using our psychological factors. So the prediction of individual outcomes requires reliable measures. And this makes intuitive sense. If the thing we're trying to predict is reliable, for instance, income is reliable over time, the things that should predict it should also be reliable. In fact, the reliability of the measures used to predict the outcomes places a ceiling on how well you could actually do at predicting these measures. And if you remember, we collected 150 people who took the entire battery a couple months later, which allows us to assess the test-retest reliability for psychological measures. I should mention here that this work was really spearheaded by Zainab, who is another graduate student in the lab and will be defending her dissertation in just 2 weeks. So go to that if you would like more information. As a quick sneak peek, what we found was that the x-axis here is called the intra-class correlation coefficient. It's just a measure of reliability. So 1, very reliable, 0, not reliable at all over time. And what we can see is that survey DBs in general are pretty reliable, while tasks run the gamut. There are some that are somewhat reliable, some that are just awful. And that makes tasks in general, we would expect them to do worse at predicting real-world outcomes. But we're not actually going to use these raw DBs. We're going to use the ontological factor scores. How reliable are those? The way we assess this is we took the factor analytical model that we fit at time point 1 and recalculated factor scores at time point 2 and used that to assess the reliability of the factor scores. So how reliable are they? Well, it turns out that they're quite reliable. What we're looking at here is now a Pearson correlation heat map with the factor scores at time point 1 on the y-axis and time point 2 at the x-axis. And we can see along the diagonal that the correlations are about 0.8. So quite reliable factor scores. It's not differentiated really between behavioral tests and self-report surveys. And in some ways, this makes sense. I mean, the way surveys get reliable outcomes is they ask a similar kind of question many different ways, and then they sum them together. And what you get is a summary score that is quite reliable. What factor analysis does is a similar kind of thing. It synthesizes similar kinds of measures into a large structure, and the central tendencies, or the weighted tendencies, becomes reliable. So we can see how these measures can kind of relate to the DBs by themselves. So I just took the average of these diagonals and just plotted it on this. We can see that they're quite reliable, and they're not differentiated in their reliability. So if we see differences in the prediction between, I'll get to you in 1 second, between surveys and tasks, it's unlikely to be a function of reliability.
Ian, you were talking about obviously test-retest reliability, but you're also referring to inter-item reliability. So did you consider that in regard to the measures themselves and the items making up your factors?
We did not.
How are you thinking of those 2 things?
Like intra-item reliability, as in like
internal consistency, maybe is another way to say it.
Yeah. So within the actual tasks, we didn't assess that at all because they're not trying to probe the same thing in different kinds of ways. For the surveys, we did not evaluate the internal validity of the surveys en masse we've had collaborators who have looked at individual surveys that we've collected to see if they kind of reproduce the factor structure that was originally reported, these kinds of things. And my understanding is in general, they've been successful, but they've only looked at a few measures. I will punt a little bit on the reliability questions in general and encourage you to ask Zainab some more questions later. But no, the general point is we didn't really look at the kind of conversion or internal reliability. We're just looking at test retest over time. Okay, so we have some reliable predictors. That means that we should think that we have some hope of predicting real world outcomes because of that. So let's see how well we do. First, we're going to look at the ability of the survey factors to predict these outcomes. So on the x-axis here, we have our 8 outcome measures. And on the y-axis, we have r squared, which measures kind of variance explained. This is how well did we do in predicting the outcomes. And this is what we get. In the dark bars, we see the cross-validated prediction accuracy. And in the light bars, we have the in-sample prediction accuracy. Let's just concentrate on the dark bars. So we can see that in general, surveys predict about 10% of the variance. Some outcomes like mental health predict 28%, some they predict less. And I've called this predictive success moderately successful. I mean, each of these outcomes are very complicated and multiply determined. Like there are many things that cause someone to be obese, and most of those aspects we probably think even before seeing this are not actually caused by psychological individual differences. Nonetheless, what we see here is that it seems that a psychological perspective does give some insight into and certainly help us predict these outcome measures. So prediction, Anthony.
You mind if maybe this is a general FTN question, but you're going with a rather causal story here.
Mm.
Were these predicted outcome variables at time 2, and they were change scores from time 1, or they were acquired concurrent with all of the task and survey?
First, let me nip in the bud. If I came across as pushing a causal story, I do not mean that. We are not evaluating causality in any way. In fact, some of these you might even think go in the opposite direction. For instance, if we find that impulsivity leads to kind of alcohol use, you might think that actually when you're filling out an impulsivity questionnaire and you're trying to think about yourself, you're like, well, I drank a lot, probably impulsive. So I am not making any claim about causality. To answer your second question though, these are concurrent. We actually didn't do this at the second time point. That said, the reliability of most of these outcome measures is quite high. And so while I didn't do that analysis, I imagine it will be weaker. I don't know, but probably not much weaker than what we're seeing here because of how reliable the actual outcomes are. Okay, so we have prediction here. That's somewhat helpful to know whether there's any relationship between psychological measures and these outcomes. But even better would try to be to understand what is the psychological breakdown of these outcomes. And to do that, we can make use of this handy-dandy visualization. Here we've got these polar plots that reflect what I like to think of as the ontological fingerprint of these different outcomes. So along the border here, we see the 12 survey factors, and the length of the spoke is going to indicate how much that factor is relevant for the prediction of the outcome. So here we see the emotional control factor. It's the only thing really that's important for predicting mental health. Binge drinking has a more complicated ontological fingerprint. It's relying on ethical risk-taking, reward sensitivity, and risk perception. So we can do this for all of these. And while similar to the kind of structure I showed you before, I think there's a lot of benefit in diving down into each of these to understand the psychological underpinnings of each of these outcomes. For now, we're not going to do that, and instead I just want you to take in the gestalt of these different fingerprints. And the thing I really want you to see is that there's not actually a lot of commonality between these different fingerprints. Each outcome is predicted by a different kind of confluence of psychological factors. There doesn't seem to be a lot of coherence there. Okay, so now I'd like you to just focus on this small bit of the y-axis. So this axis goes up to 45% variance explained. This axis only goes to 15%. And that's because I'm about to show you the task predictions, and they do much worse. In fact, they do abysmally. In general, they predict 1% of the variance explained. And that's not to say that they do worse than surveys all the time. In fact, they actually do better at predicting income/life milestones than the surveys. And they also do it in a kind of non-overlapping manner. That is, if you put tasks and surveys into the same model, you actually do even better at predicting this outcome. And if we look at the fingerprint, we see that discounting, that thing kind of analogous to the delay of gratification, is the aspect that predicts this. So I guess we can see that as somewhat convergent evidence with the marshmallow story, but the prediction is very weak. Even here, where it's 5% of the variance, hardly something to write home about, and certainly not the entirety of what causes someone to be successful in life. Okay, with that, I'd like to summarize. So what I've shown you today is a perspective that I think gives better clarity about the organization of mental processes. We've broken down the simplifying kind of coherence of these different constructs and better understood how they relate to each other. This has all been encapsulated in a quantitative structure, separately for tasks and surveys. And while I've talked about this at a kind of high level today, I want to make the point that structures like this are actually very easily explorable. Many psychological hypotheses actually are borne out in terms of kind of thoughts about how different psychological measurements should be correlated. And hypotheses of that form are already embedded in this structure. So I see structures like this as serving an important exploratory step in psychological science. People should look at this to give themselves some perspective on hypotheses they have before going on to do more confirmatory work. At a higher level, we've seen that surveys and tasks are disconnected. Now, we're not the first ones to show this, but we do show it at a kind of unprecedented scale. And the fact that measurement categories are separated, not just based on their kind of measurement type, not based on cognitive constructs, is deeply problematic and really flies in the face of the language we use as psychologists. Next, I kind of showed you how and whether and how these measures relate to real-world behaviors. We saw that surveys kind of predict decently well and have a heterogeneous kind of relationship to a number of different outcomes, but tasks do pretty poorly. Finally, where does that leave us with self-regulation? Well, we found that there were a range of psychological constructs that were differentially but weakly related to real-world outcomes. We saw that important constructs do not generalize across measurement categories. I think overall, we saw little support for self-regulation's coherence as a construct. I think it's time that we move beyond this kind of simplifying idea of self-regulation, a simplistic story of human behavior in favor of a kind of more complicated, multifaceted one. Now, it's easy to say that we should move beyond simplification, but more complicated stories are difficult to make use of. It's important that we have a quantitative framework to kind of keep this in check, to allow us to actually make useful progress when we're operating in this more complicated landscape. And that's what I've shown you today. Thanks so much. Okay, so I think we're going to take some questions, then I have some acknowledgments, and then we'll kick people out. So what time is it now? I think we'll take 5 minutes for question. Anthony.
I know that's a lot, so sorry.
That's fine.
You go back to this high-level point about self-regulation. So you've shown that this factor analysis actually results in a more reliable estimate of some underlying sort of psychological constructs.
Yeah.
You haven't then further gone on though, and so then you take each of those and you see how they predict real-world outcomes.
Yes.
If you haven't taken a multivariate approach over those, which might be this question about is there something like a self-regulation, which is sort of the interaction between these underlying constructs. Yeah. And then shown that that in fact doesn't result in a better explanatory model. One might argue that some of these surveys are tapping into those. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, so to just repeat the question, maybe expand a little, tell me if I'm going beyond. It's possible that, first of all, there's higher order structure in the factors that I've shown, so maybe there's like a self-regulatory higher order structure. There's also self-regulatory theories that are interactive in nature. Basically, one thing should predict as a function of something else. Self-regulatory researchers aren't, they don't have a very simplistic perspective on how different things should interact. So the ways that we tried, and we have not, I'll say I haven't done a kind of theory first perusal, but what I have tried to do is use, first of all, somewhat more complicated methods than I ended up using regularized regression here, which should find somewhat more complicated combinations of factors that are able to kind of predict these outcomes. And what I've discovered in this work is that in general we were overfitting. So I'm not sure if I can rule, I can't rule out potential interactive perspectives, but at this point, with this kind of data set, I think such perspectives would be overly complicated for what the data can support. For the higher order idea, I used a rotational method for these factors that does allow there to be some higher order structure. The structure here did not, to me, reflect a kind of anything that corresponded to self-regulation. For me, I really hang the reason I make this point that we should move beyond this idea of self-regulation is I really think it puts forward a claim that there is something, like people talk about all of these outcomes that I'm talking about as self-regulatory failures. That's how powerful a kind of theoretical framework it is. Like these things are all derived from the same kind of cause, this problem with this subset of psychological functions. And that doesn't seem to be the case, even if there is like a complicated interactive story. It still seems to be that each one is related to its own kind of milieu of psychological causes. Other people? Sophie?
I'm curious about, I think this consistency between surveys and outcome measures, the inconsistency between tasks and outcome measures is really interesting. I'm curious about the kind of similarities and differences in the way people are being asked to respond. So it's interesting that you find a lot of coherence between survey PVs and survey outcome measures.
Yep.
And I'm curious with the tasks, I know there's a desire in the field to connect task responses to these outcome measures.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering if you could speculate a little bit on if there would be a way to create kind of outcome tasks in a way. If like part of the reason you're not finding connections is because of what they're tapping into, in the sense that there's this kind of online processing and reasoning, and then there's this kind of reflective reasoning on long-term behavioral patterns. And if there's just kind of a mistake in trying to tie tasks to these kind of survey outcome measures, and if there's like a correlating task outcome measure that might be out there.
Yeah, so to just restate the question, maybe it's not surprising that self-report surveys that are supposed to measure psychological measures also predict self-report outcome measures. Maybe this is kind of some divide I created. These are psychological, these are outcome, and we find relationships with them, but it's really part of this more general thing that we saw, that surveys relate to each other and tasks don't relate to surveys. That's possible. I think there are a number of things that make me not think that that's the whole story. Part of that is, first of all, the survey, the outcome measures that I used here, it would be a case against their validity, which might be true, that they're actually probing something in the real world. So for instance, if questions like how often do you smoke are really disconnected from how often you smoke and really just in this kind of like, self-reflective thing, then that would be really problematic for these surveys. And that would be itself a horrible kind of state of affairs for psychology, because a lot of people rely on these surveys, and I do think that they're actually relatively valid. Nonetheless, let's go with that for a second. We've shown, even here, that for some outcomes, here at income/life milestones, and in other work, certain political ideologies, that tasks actually predict these outcomes fairly well, or at least they predict them better or equally as well as surveys. So that points out to me that there are at least some kind of outcomes where the task constructs seem to do well. So it's not so clear a separation, and that gives me even more confidence that when we're seeing kind of a null relationship, it's in fact a null relationship. The final way I'll respond to that is just to say, I mean, I'm not trying to necessarily make a point here that surveys are much better than tasks. Maybe they have different purposes, but if surveys kind of only related to these outcomes because of this maybe trivial kind of method covariance, that would be even more negative as a case, because then the then it's like kind of overestimated, and the task predictions are pretty poor. All of that said, I don't actually know what it would be like if you tried to predict kind of more ecological measures using the task measures in the end. Dan?
Yeah, well, let me just ask the same kind of question, but in a little more pointed way, which is all the numbers were low.
Yeah.
All the prediction numbers were low.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that represents a sort of profound failure? And if so, what would you recommend people do about it? Can your ontological methodology help them fix this in some deep way, or?
So I'm not sure. A problem here is when we see low predictivity, it can mean one of two things, or like many things, but one case is, taking an individual difference, like psychological individual difference approach, in reality only counts for so much of the variance, and many other factors are the ones that we should be considering. Another one is that, so that might be the truth, and we're getting at the perfect truth here, and this is just the cap of what psychological traits can do. But another one is that we have poor measurements, or just doing a bad job at kind of reflecting the kind of mental structure, or these kind of things. And the only way to really kind of adjudicate between those is have a full model that does a good job in predicting as much of the behavior as possible, where psychological and environmental factors and the other factors you think might play into these outcomes all are allowed to kind of compete and show their relative kind of contribution. And we're just very far away from that. So to answer your question, whether I see this as a failure for psychological measurement kind of waits to be seen. I'm not sure if even in an ideal world, a psychological individual trait perspective will do much better. A few decades ago, this kind of argument was a kind of sticking point, and part of the argument between kind of personality psychologists and social psychologists, like which is a more fruitful way of thinking about human behavior. Should we be thinking about it as these stable individual traits? Does that actually allow us to predict much? Or should we really be trying to understand the context? And here, of course, just taking one perspective and seeing that it only does this well doesn't tell us what the possible ceiling is. So, Tyler.
So, given, if we imagine for a minute that our lives are determined by more than just the psychology between our ears,
Sure.
or the actions that we take.
Yeah.
If we allow for a moment that our lives are determined by the context that we live in, then the question is, well, why might we expect that behavior on a task would predict anything about this? And so, and that's a sincere question.
Sure.
Is who would expect that your performance on a delayed non-master sample task is going to predict, quote, real world outcomes? And what might we learn if it did?
Sure. So, I mean, I think who expects that is some people. Some people definitely expect that. For whatever reason, there have been some idea. I mean, the same thing can be said for the surveys themselves, right? Before this work and other people's work, I'd have no reason to think that the way of measuring psychology through tasks or surveys should differentially relate to real-world outcomes, and so people found that tasks relate to real-world outcomes in the past, and so think that now. The fact that you might have this overarching kind of central tendency that dictates how you interact with a variety of contexts, different environmental contexts that lead to your, your life outcomes or anything like that. I feel like that's a deeply intuitive concept. In fact, it's such an intuitive concept that, I mean, this was part of the social psychology personality debate, like this idea that maybe personality, which we all assume, like we just see it, maybe that's a product of every time I interact with you, Tyler, I'm there. I interact with you in a very similar context over and over again. And so I have this like illusion that you're relatively stable because of this. That's, so like, I think that if there was a case that individual traits played a role, it actually corresponds very nicely with how people kind of normally think about things. I'm going to move on to just acknowledgments, and happy to talk later about the rest of this. Okay, so I'm gonna go to acknowledgments. So first, let's look at this beautiful picture right here, asking a wonderful question, like, what can neuroimaging tell us about thoughts? Who would be so bold to say that they have an answer to such a question, such an important question to cognitive neuroscience circa 2019? This guy. So let's try to understand who Russ is in the most intuitive way possible. Here we go. On the left, we have a network representing Russ before he ate. He's not caffeinated. On the right, we have him after he ate, after caffeinated. And by a little perusal of his Facebook page, I have a feeling that the left state is kind of noxious and deserves to be avoided at all costs. But more sincerely, Russ is a builder. He's not just a builder of sheds or amazing research programs. Instead, Russ sees what needs to be built, and he lays the infrastructure to get there. Cognitive neuroscience is still a young field. We're still refining the tools we need. And while there's there's a long way to go before we get to the precision we want, we're a hell of a lot closer than where we started. And Russ deserves no small portion of the credit for our advances. He's made it clear to me that enabling others building tools is a powerful way to impact science. I also admire Russ's mixture of skepticism and pragmaticism. While I probably brought those traits a little bit here myself, they've certainly been developed under his care. He's also quite hopeful about the future of science. I remember one time I was kind of musing dejectedly that this kind of work was atheoretical, and Russ corrected pre-theoretical, which I really found nice. He's also been quite supportive beyond my wildest expectations. I came in wanting to study very different things, and like most people when they come here, I think that they don't actually know that much about what they're interested in, what the environment will support, or how they intersect. When I first heard, and was subsequently ruined by the idea of ontologies, I immediately jumped on, and Russ, as he mentioned in the beginning, he cautioned me a little bit that like such an open-ended project might not be the best thing for a graduate student. But nonetheless, seeing my enthusiasm, he supported me and allowed me to function as a leader in this multi-institute project. The ownership and freedom that I was given over this project was really astounding. And while it came with great challenges and mostly existential, the consequence is I've become technically and conceptually a competent scientist in ways that I really couldn't have imagined before I came here. So thanks, Russ. I'd also, of course, the Poldrek Lab isn't just Russ. There are many other people. And this is our newest lab photo, but there are a few people missing here. So I'm just going to put them on. I just want to call out a few of them. Vanessa is kind of the creative font funneled into a technical wizard. And she's just, when she came here, she was just such an inspiration, so creative. She was like she would leave for a weekend and come back with a whole new idea and it implemented. She was integral to the work I showed here. She developed what's called the Experiment Factory with me to collect most of this data. Mac came, I think in my second year, and brought with him like just a passion and sociability and curiosity that I think really benefited the lab. My first paper at Stanford was written with him, and that was because he kind of reached his hand out and asked me to join him, and that was great. For a while, Chris is no longer part of the lab, but he was really like the foundation of the lab and helped me in innumerable ways. And this year, he actually became kind of a professional mentor for me, really helped me with the transition. I'd like to thank Zainab. So Zainab is in my cohort. She didn't come to the lab until our second year under not the most ideal circumstances, but I've been very thankful that she joined. She's been a wonderful collaborator, she's been a confidant, and I know she's going to be an amazing scientist when she leaves here. I mean, she's great now. Finally, I'd like to thank Patrick. So Patrick has been my closest collaborator while I've been here. He's been an amazing scientific mentor, but he also really helped me early on in graduate school with kind of existential problems, and really was like a rock of support. And I know, I mean, again, he's a great scientist now, but I know when he leaves, particularly Patrick, he's going to be a wonderful PI. He's just a wonderful mentor. He's very supportive, and he's a great scientist. So thanks, Patrick. I'd also like to thank Jay on his phone and Rosa, two members of my committee. Both have been very generous with their time, and in particular, I'd like to thank you, Jay. You've been an inspiration since the first time we spoke during my interview. Your kind of stubbornness and creativity, I'll call it doggedness, your doggedness, creativity and passion have just been like epitomized everything I want to be in a scientist. Next, I'd like to thank Mike, another member on my committee. Mike taught the most impactful class I took at Stanford, and I was lucky enough to teach it with him later, and that really helped shape what kind of scientist I wanted to be. Justin also taught me a wonderful class, and I was able to teach with him a few times. And Justin really communicated to me how to, like, honestly, like, read a paper, understand how science is contextualized, and I think I'm a much better scientist because of him. Okay, moving on, I also was able to serve the graduate committee for 2 years, and I really enjoyed serving with all these people. I learned a lot about politics, about communication, compromise. I also served with a number of graduate students that I don't have up here, but really this was a wonderful opportunity to kind of debate the philosophy of like teaching and psychology in the department. Particularly want to call out Colony, who is just a steadfast and patient leader and really helped make a lot of things happen. Okay, so I want to move from my these illustrious faculty to my illustrious office mate, Dr. Dan. So Dr. Dan, while he tries occasionally to be serious, he often knows that that's just a facade. And we'll go back to explaining whatever he was explaining at the time. It's hard for me to overstate how impactful Dan's been. Part of the reason I came here, I think, was because of kind of meeting Dan on our walk on the dish. He's helped my science in so many ways, from like conceptual and analytical problems to minutia, like what size font do I want in a plot. My plots were aesthetically pleasing. There's no small credit due to Dan. Finally, he's also a wonderful teacher, and I've learned a lot about that craft from him. Next, I'd like to thank Guillaume. Guillaume is simply the most creative and playful person I've ever met. He's also the only person I've known to ask for a blanket at a wine room. I've known him since my first day at college, and he followed me here thanks to my complete happiness. Guillaume, I'll just tell one story about him to kind of communicate how he's kind of pushed me in my life and how I'm constantly trying to reach his kind of creative peaks. So we went light painting one time in undergrad. So light painting is like we had like a long exposure camera and a little flashlight, and I drew like a circle, and I thought myself really creative. I made like a little heart, I put an arrow through it. And Guillaume, he made a unicycle, and then he posed on top of it right for the picture. So, I don't know, the only thing I'll say is it's just like amazing to be surrounded by people like that. So, moving on, I'd of course like to thank my cohort. I've loved spending time with you guys. Graduate school is a crucible, and we are all the product, and I'm just very excited to see what the rest of you are going to do with your lives. Of course, there are many other people who have been very important to me, who supported me in graduate school and made me feel very happy, and thank you all. Finally, I'd like to thank my family. So during my graduate school, actually, each of these people have gone through their own kind of changes, challenges. I've seen them kind of take on new things in their lives and thrive, and it's been honestly quite inspirational. And of course, they also support me quite a lot and bring me a lot of joy. finally, I'd like to call out my brother and his new fiance, Allie. I'm very happy for you guys. So with that, thanks so much. Okay, so I think what's basically going to happen is you guys are all going to leave. We're going to be here for some amount of time to a bit. Dan, can you handle my family?
I'm glad that's the last thing on this video.